Well, it's 4 o'clock, guys, so I think we can start to be very punctual. First of all, Ms. Salama, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's a pleasure to have you here to speak a bit about the OHCHR's Faith for Rights framework and the origin, challenges, and good practices that it entails. My name is Ana Teresa, and I'm the project assistant to the Nelson Mandela World Moot Court competition. So first of all, to set the grounds for the conversation today, I would just like to remind all the listeners that this video will also be available forward, and as per the competition rules, it'll also be translated into French and Spanish in order to ensure accessibility for all the languages we work with. Please do not hesitate to interact with us. If you have any questions, please just write them in the comments below, and we'll address them throughout the conference. I would also like to leave a small note for undergraduate and graduate students of any field of knowledge throughout the world that the registrations for the 12th World Moot are currently open. We already have 100+ universities registered from universities all over the world, of which over 101 are speaking and will be competing in English, 12 in Spanish, and 9 in French, and of which 36 are from the African region, 23 from the Asian Pacific region, 15 from Latin America, and 14 from Western Europe and others, and 3 from Eastern Europe. So we especially encourage participation from the Francophone and Spanish-speaking communities. So before any further delay, I would like to briefly introduce Mr. Salama and then invite him to also introduce himself. And I would also like to thank the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for making this event possible, and Mr. Eduardo Capapelu, coordinator of the World Moot. So Mr. Salama has served for over 30 years as a diplomat, predominantly with multilateral governments. He has been Director of International Legal Affairs at the Egyptian Foreign Service. He is an independent expert with human rights mechanisms. He was chief of the UN Secretariat on the Durban Review Conference in 2009, and he is currently chief of the Human Rights Treaty branch of the OHCHR since 2007. He is also the coordinator of the OHCHR initiative that emanates from the Durban Review outcome, the prohibition of incitement to hatred, and coordinator of the OHCHR's Faith for Right initiative. So as you can see, Mr. Salama has a wide range of experience, not only with issues relating human rights and faith actors, but also a thorough understanding of the human rights faith work. So without further delay, Mr. Salama, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about yourself and your work at the OHCHR, and what led you to spearhead the creation of the Faith for Rights Toolkit?
One can summarize the history of the human rights movement with one interesting parameter. It always goes nearer to the people. So everything at the UN is intergovernmental. It's an intergovernmental organization, but progressively over the 75 years, we are celebrating the 75th year of the UN very soon, it has been increasingly going nearer to the individuals. So from the notion of state responsibility, we are now at also non-state actors' responsibilities and roles. This ranges from business and human rights to the individual responsibilities to the militias, for example, in humanitarian law, but also to faith actors, which are among, I would say, the latecomers into the arena of the United Nations for many reasons that we can discuss if you wish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction. And so when one reads the Beirut Declaration, it's very clear that it's a very different document. On one side, the citations of the different religions, and on the other, the Faith for Rights Toolkit that accompanies it, and that has a very practical and engaging approach. So I wonder what led you to create the Faith for Rights Toolkit?
The Declaration of Beirut 2017 on Faith for Rights is composed of two documents, a declaration and the 18 commitments that correspond to them. It articulates and defines the faith actors' role and responsibilities in the area of human rights. This was the very first global attempt to conceptualize the relationships between religions and human rights. Before that, there has always been encounters, predominantly, I have to say, controversial and difficult. One of the reasons, in my personal view, is that the overall, I don't want to say philosophical, but at least intellectual framework of that relationship between rights and religions has never been clarified. There has been so many interesting attempts. We pulled the thread in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the Durban Review Conference in 2009, where the issue of religions and the politics related to it was important. I wouldn't go into the details of this, just to say that religions became an issue, and at times, it's not about religions, the problem in reality, it's about human interpretations of religions. It's about manipulation of religions. It's about misuse of religions as a vehicle to serve an ideology or a political interest. So unpacking what is religion and what is human interpretation of religion was the first intellectual premise of clarification of this relationship. The second premise that prompted Beirut was that if you look at the literature and the encounters, you will find that either apologetic, people from different religious traditions trying to explain that they are not against human rights, or the other extreme, i.e. confrontational, or in the in-between, what I call opportunistic or at best sectorial, i.e. we need an issue from a religious actor, so we go and speak about this and we withdraw as soon as possible. There are reasons for this. First reason, secularism, the important principle that the state has to be neutral among religions. The second one is freedom of religion. But treating freedom of religion in isolation of other human rights can create perceptions of tensions. For example, if you have freedom of religion, does this allow you to say anything and everything? Can freedom of religion limit freedom of expression? Or are they reconcilable, and how? So starting in Beirut, tensions were not denied. They were just defined, the scope of the tensions. And this declaration also is based on what I call the double convergence. What is common among all religious traditions? Because at the United Nations, we cannot deal with one religion. And by the way, Article 18 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that defines the freedom of religion, we always forget the second half of the sentence, which is freedom of religion or belief. And beliefs include atheism, for example. One has the right not to have a religion. And this is a belief that gets the same equal protection as a human rights, and the right to freedom of conscience, as those people who have classical religious traditions in a way. So this is also another dormant tension, the believers and the non-believers, that this belief is absolutely a belief in itself and it should be protected as such. So these are the premises that tensions may exist, but there are common grounds as well. So I would say roughly the tensions may be 5 or 10% of the contempt of human rights and religions, but why not work on the other 90 or 95%? So the double convergence means that we start by identifying what's common between all religious traditions and what's common between them and human rights. And the result was the 18 commitments on faithful rights.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting, especially because there's traditionally a supposed opposition between religions or beliefs and human rights. But in the end, many of their benchmarks and many of their premises are the same. So it's very interesting that you say that. So I was wondering if you could share with us a bit of the rapid plan of action and how national judicial systems could engage with it. How could states engage with this plan in a thorough way?
In fact, Rabat Plan of Action was the first step towards the Beirut 18 commitments on faithful rights. The difference is 5 years, and this is relatively quite fast in terms of standard setting at the international level. In Rabat, it's a plan to combat incitement to hatred and discrimination. And it set abilities for a number of actors, including religious actors. And these were the specific responsibilities that religious actors should not commit not to use the religion as a ground to promote or to formulate incitement to hatred. And that if this happens in the name of the religion, they take a second commitment to distance themselves from this. And the third commitment was to contain people feelings when they, in the name of being offended, because whether we like it or not, there is no right not to be offended. As long as the free speech, even if it goes to the borderline of irresponsible speech, as long as it did not incite to an action that discriminates or is violent against somebody else, it remains legal. And this is very important. Otherwise, freedom of expression is the foundation for all human rights. If you cannot freely express your views, no other human rights can be defended. So this was Rabat 2012. The fact that Rabat was very needed, and it showed that it was useful, because how to distinguish, Rabat had a threshold of a very practical test to distinguish between hate speech and free speech, which depends on a case-by-case basis. What is the content of the speech? What is the status of the speaker? What is the context in which he or she is speaking? What's his or her relationship with the audience? And what's the probable impact of what is being said? And if the 5 criteria lead to the fact that the person has particular influence, and this applies very squarely to religious actors because they're spiritually, they have a leverage on the recipients of their discourse, then they have even to be more careful about what they say. Religion does not justify that one says anything in the name of his or her religion or belief, but one needs a criteria and a practical test. And I'm very pleased that even at the level of Facebook, for example, because social media is the main theater where this borderline between free speech and hate speech and fake news, which is also can be part of insightful speech or not, depending on case by cases. Facebook found the relevance, and they collaborated with us in the Office of the High Commissioner, and they helped to translate to 32 languages the threshold of Rabat. Just to tell you that it's a very practical thing. Human rights do not belong to lawyers. Human rights is not an issue to discuss at the United Nations. It is on the territory, in the street, in the village, in the family as well.
And yes, of course. And I think this is one of the greatest fights that we have as human rights activists, practitioners, and scholars, is to bring it back to the real world, to leave the cocktails and to leave a bit the UN and come back to the real world. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the impact of the toolkit on governments and on religious leaders. How has it been concretizing?
We are hardly starting to pilot it in practice because it was vetted in Cologne last December only, so only 6 months ago. But during these 6 months, the interactions, the beginnings of the pilots that we have were eye-opener, were positive, were encouraging, because this is a document which is meant to empower individuals and communities. You asked me about the reactions of states. Of course, states have the primary responsibility in terms of all human rights, including freedom of religion or belief. But there are also many non-state actors who have influence, on which states at times have little leverage. So this is the document that addresses first and foremost faith communities, faith actors, individuals in their own spheres of influences, more than a document that requires a state action as such. So the test now for us from the very first piloting, we did it in, and again, I was going to say thanks to the pandemic, that's a paradoxical thing to say. Because of the pandemic, we have had even much larger opportunities to test and outreach. And so far, I feel that on one hand, it's a promising document. On the second hand, if you look at it, it looks a little bit overwhelming. It's 105 pages. But I always make the analogy, consider this as a menu. When you enter to a restaurant, you don't call for all the principal plates, you don't call for all the desserts, otherwise you die. So you select what you want to target and what you want to address as faith actors. It is a peer-to-peer learning tool. It's a tool that tells you on this particular topic, on women's rights, on freedom of expression, on economic rights, what is the comparative view of the religious traditions as seen from the prism of human rights at the same time, and what is the result of this unpacking and interaction at the same time. And when you said that, when I said that we need to get nearer to the people, we also need to adapt the narrative. The whole rationale is to have a narrative that's not too legalistic. So you will find in the toolkit videos, encounters, statements, pieces of art, calligraphy, music. On each and every, even one of the peer-to-peer learning modules that we suggest, it's called Get Inspired. So participants get from their own cultural spheres an artistic expression that would reflect the commitment in question, either by being for it or it contradicts it. The idea is to start to speak a different language, not the legalistic language which is usually associated to human rights or to multilateralism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and following up on that, I wonder if you could expand a bit more specifically on the inclusion of moot courts within the toolkit and the hypothetical cases, because that dialogues a lot with our moot court. And as you know, our case this year involves freedom of religion and human rights. So it would be great to hear you speak a bit about that.
Frankly, we were greatly inspired by your experience in the moot court, because ultimately we want to simulate real life situations in a convincing way. So given that the moot court is basically addressed to law students and to legal forums of the preparation of young lawyers and researchers on law, our audience is different. It's religious actors. So we wanted to be less legal, and that's why we call it, you will find that the toolkit is 18 modules of peer-to-peer learning, exercises to be adapted by the peer learners. But the second half of the document, almost 50 pages of it, is cases to debate, which is an analogy with moot courts exactly. So we simplified the moot courts by suggesting provocative cases to debate, cases that are difficult. The beauty of that toolkit is that it doesn't even attempt to bring answers. It adds more questions, because it aspires to inject two things: interreligiosity, interfaith, intercourse, and secondly, critical thinking in the religious sphere. In a nutshell, religions, in one word, beg submission. That's what one thinks when you hear the term. And words matter, and perceptions that come with it. Words are loaded, so we need to unpack them. So religions means automatically submission. Human rights means automatically liberation. Hence the initial instinctive, almost perception of contradiction. So we wanted to break these silos and to say, hey, in human rights as well, there is a debate, and in religion as well, there are freedom of expression. And examples from the religious traditions about dialogues and disagreements are inspiring. I wonder how this is one of the strongest perceptions, that religion is only about submission, when religion is also, like human rights, about liberation. Religions were among the historical sources of human dignity and human rights in the first place. How can they be against it? Of course, and here comes the human factor. Humans can distort anything almost, and that's why they need to put themselves into question and to compare notes between the two disciplines.
Of course, that was very, very enlightening. So I would actually like to ask you, there are 5 basic principles. So transcending interfaith dialogues, avoiding theological doctrinal divides, introspectiveness, speaking with one voice, and the decision to act in a fully independent manner. I would like you to speak about introspectiveness, because I feel it's something that we often don't speak about in the human rights world, and I think it's a very important point to include. What is exactly, for our listeners, what is introspectiveness? What do you mean? What is the goal of that third principle?
This third principle is an anti-politicization and manipulation principle.
Okay.
In practice, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether states or non-state actors, at times are using religions for a purpose. So instead of looking at themselves, they look at the others only. The criteria of sincerity of any endeavor is that you start by applying love. We were cut a little bit, but did I come across, or should I repeat?
If you could just repeat the sentences, please, just to make sure we heard. I couldn't hear you.
Introspective is an antidote to manipulation in the name of religions. Religions are being used at times as shield and sword, just to attack others, as an ideology. Introspective means if you want to engage on religious spheres, start by yourself. See your own, and it's in all the religious traditions. That sincerity means that you start by putting your own house in order before asking others to do the same. So the 5 principles were the lessons learned from the recent history of religions and human rights, from religions and politics, from inter-religious encounters, because at times they are either only dialogues and niceties and photo sessions, or they are tools of war and killing in the name of God. And the in-between was lacking rules of engagement, if I dare to say. Sorry for the military nature of the exercise. Really, rules of engagement in the most peaceful sense of engaging others. Hence, that you need not to talk about theology, otherwise you're not here to convert anybody to what you think about God or about divinity or about spirituality. You're here just to exchange on what is the common ground. You have to start by yourself and be introspective to the end of the 5 principles.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and in fact, that applies to many situations in life apart from religion as well, that we have to focus on within before we can actually expect the world or others to follow. So I think to conclude, I would just like to hear a bit about what are your perspectives or your long-term goals with the toolkit. What do you think this can lead to, considering the gap that it was created to fill?
We hope that it leads to enlarging the civil society space, inviting an actor which have been sidelined for too long, either because of relativism or fear that the religious discourse is dogmatic, while human rights is engaging, so they don't mix well. We hope that it will add to the human rights protection and to the human rights universality. We hope that it will create a new narrative. We hope that it will bring, it's not only about faith for rights, it's also art for faith for rights. It's culture that does not compromise on rights, but can show that universality is a permanent construct in the making, and that we will never reach perfection. Look at artificial intelligence. Look at this pandemic. I mean, it defies humanity. It defies all the structure on which our organization and society and even law is based. It reminds us that economic rights are fundamental as well. And if they remain aspirations, we get what we are in now, and that the priorities and that the empowerment of the other should not be a matter of charity. Even in religions, although charity is associated to religions, I think it's another terminological trap. In most religious traditions, solidarity is a duty and not charity.
Okay. Yeah, charity is very, very different from empowerment and from solidarity. And I think just last but not least, what advice would you give to the moot participants who are currently engaged with the case and with the very state of art and very difficult issues involving religion and human rights and freedom of expression? What would be your call out to the youth?
I really look forward to it with a lot of excitement because it's fresh look and it's young generations thinking at our current problems that always open new avenues. It's not false modesty at all. We learn from every regard on this toolkit because many parts of it, it's dilemmas more than answers, but it's methods of approaching them to try on a case-by-case basis to find the right balance between competing factors. This is life, the legal science, but also theology. It's about arbitrating between different competing factors in one given situation. So learning how to think together, how to reconcile disciplines, how to think in an interdisciplinary manner, how to accept difference, how to put oneself into question, rethinking everything is a guarantee to improvement on every front.
And hopefully we'll strive towards the creation of as you mentioned, as a culture and environment, political community of human rights, and not only a discourse.
In fact, religious actors have a huge influence on the hearts and minds of millions of people. That is why they are potentially very influential actors in preventing human rights abuses, particularly in the times of pandemics. And I would say that the main difference between their role and others is that they have access to grassroots levels that probably other actors may not be easily accessing. And secondly, the spiritual and moral leverage that they have over their followers is far exceeding usual non-state actors. Actually, religious actors are very well placed to use the toolkit. What is the toolkit about? It's an interesting, creative methodology of engaging into a discussion through storytelling, through videos, through personal experiences sharing. But this is very much near to the preaching and to the counseling and to the advising that religious actors do. So in a way, as a genuinely peer-to-peer learning tool, the toolkit as a number of modules and exercises of interfaith dialogue and debate is never the same. It's like a river. Wherever it passes in an environment, it gets from it. Module 0, before the 18 commitments, is a module, before the 18 modules, is a module about how to adapt these techniques of peer-to-peer learning to your own environment, whether you're speaking within one religious community or on an interfaith basis, whether you are doing it to cover a particular issue or in general intercommunal tensions. So it all depends on the context, but they are certainly well placed. This is what they are doing already. What is missing is the human rights narrative mixed to the religious narrative. The tensions among rights is not something shocking. It's not something that cannot happen. It happens every day. And it's all in the interpretation. So freedom of religion has to be seen in a full-fledged picture of human rights as a whole. Freedom of expression is part of it. Your freedom stops where the freedoms of others start. So there are many manifestations of freedom of religion or belief that could raise discussion. And it's on a case-by-case basis. For example, the headscarf is an issue that has divided many societies because it's powerful symbolism and because also of the political manipulation of religious symbols at times. The clear rule is that all human rights are interrelated and indivisible, and they should be mutually reinforcing. If there is a tension, one needs to address this on a case-by-case basis. One thing is certain, the religious sphere is not only about submission. It's not only about diktat coming from a superior authority in the name of a supernatural power. To the contrary, It's a message of day-to-day life, and people need to discuss it as much as they discuss any other matter of their own life. The storytelling and the history of religions is always about daily lives of people and the significance of the details in it. So it takes attention, and it takes respect, and it takes dialogue to be able to arbitrate when rights are intentions among each other.
So, Mr. Salama, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you here. It was a very enriching conversation. Just since we have a little technical issue in the beginning, I'd like to make it clear to everyone that this video will be available on our Moot pages, and it will also be transcribed to Spanish and French to ensure we fulfill our outreach to all the languages we work with. And we look forward to meeting you again soon. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody.